Hello and welcome to the St. Louis Online. I'm Pete Smith, co-chairman of the 40th National Narrow Gage Convention Planning Committee. The video you are about to watch is part of a series of clinics and layout tours presented as a virtual but slimmed down version of our narrow gauge convention, which had to be canceled due to the coronavirus. We thank all of our presenters for their support and for allowing us to share their work with you. Our thanks also to Russ Segner, Robin Peel, and Bruce Stewart for producing this series. For more information on this video and others, go to our website at 40nngc.com. We hope you enjoy the program that follows.
Hi everyone, my name's Terry Wheeler, and I would like to welcome you to a tour of the Black Canyon of the Gunnison River, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, and my personal history with both the canyon and the railroad. The Black Canyon was part of the famous narrow gauge circle. The tour started on the Rio Grande at Salida, Colorado, and traveling westbound to Gunnison over Marshall Pass, continuing from there through the Black Canyon to Montrose, then up the Ouray branch to Ridgway. From Ridgway, the tour took the Rio Grande Southern to Durango, where it returned to the Rio Grande, then over Cumbres Pass to Alamosa and on to Salida. Wouldn't it be great to take that ride? Sadly, except for the Cumbres and Toltec portion, it's all gone forever. The 1908 logo goes to the heart of Colorado narrow gauge railroading, and it was inspired by the Curecanti Needle, which abides deep in the Black Canyon of the Gunnison. In this clinic, we will explore the canyon, its scenic grandeur, and look at its many perils along the way. Let's start with a short history of this amazing part of the railroad listed in the Denver and Rio Grande timetables as the 2nd District of the 3rd Division. The 3rd Division was divided into 3 districts. The 1st District was Salida to Gunnison via Marshall Pass, 73.6 miles across an incredibly difficult mountain path. The 2nd District was Gunnison to Grand Junction, 135.85 miles, containing some of the toughest terrain in the world. The 3rd District was Salida to Alamosa via Mears Junction, 85.33 miles. Including its 8 branches, the 3rd Division contained 493.83 miles. My great-uncle, Arthur E. Rice, was employed as master mechanic over both the 2nd and 3rd Divisions. He was headquartered in Salida and held this position until he was promoted to superintendent of motive power. In 1957, he became chief operating officer. If you want to know the distance between 2 points, just ask the railroad. They'll tell you to the 100th of a mile. Stay with me. All this will become relevant later in this program. The Black Canyon was formed by the South Fork of the Gunnison River and is 48 miles long. That's 48 miles of some of the sheerest cliffs in the world, most of which were carved out of solid granite by a violent and dangerous river. Even the calmest waters hide deadly undertows. The canyon's greatest depth is 2,722 feet. Its narrowest distance across the rim is 1,100 feet. And at the bottom, in one spot, it's an incredible 40 feet wide. The river drops at an average rate of 43 feet per mile, and at one point at 240 feet per mile. Huge boulders break off the walls and come crashing into the river below on a regular basis. At one location, the river is completely covered over by these rocks. No, it's not dammed up, just out of sight. It's called the Black Canyon because in many places the sun only shines for an hour or so each day. Not exactly the ideal terrain in which to build a railroad. Enter General Palmer and his Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. Although he had been told a number of times it couldn't be done, General Palmer didn't have the word impossible in his vocabulary. His vision was to have his railroad join the Transcontinental Link in Salt Lake City, and he wasn't going to let a little thing like the Black Canyon in the Gunnison stand in his way. In 1881, he sent in his own surveyors, who somehow managed to find a way to grade a roadbed through the canyon. When they reached the confluence of Cimarron Creek, they were finally able to convince the general it was impossible to go any further. The railroad was forced to turn south through the Cimarron Canyon. Finally, in August of 1882, the first locomotive rolled into the little town of Cimarron, Colorado. General Palmer had his railroad through the Black Canyon, but at what cost? Financially, $168,000 per mile in 1880. Imagine what that would be today. I did a little math and it comes to $4.2 million per mile. The distance through the canyon is 12 miles, so building it today would cost $50 million. What about the human cost? That was never fully disclosed. We do know in 1881 a crew was using an unfamiliar explosive called nitroglycerin. The nitroglycerin accidentally detonated. The foreman, a man named Sweeney, was blown into the river and his body disappeared forever. Another worker on the grading crew had his head, left shoulder, and side so mangled that he died within an hour. Another worker by the name of Cunningham was blown 50 feet away, but was unharmed. The Black Canyon of the Gunnison had begun to take its toll. Just for a moment, picture yourself hanging down the side of a cliff held by hundreds of feet of rope, drilling a hole and packing it full of black powder or worse, nitroglycerin. Then you light the fuse and pray those guys on the other end of the rope pull you up fast enough. If the explosion didn't kill you, the sudden stop at the bottom would. There isn't enough money in the whole world to get me to do that. On the other hand, there's nothing I wouldn't give to have the canyon back. Please join me now for a milepost by milepost journey through the Black Canyon, starting in Sapinero and culminating in Cimarron. We'll talk about some interesting things along the way, like track, structures, bridges, maintenance division, and even water closets. I have divided this trip into 5 sections. In each section, I will start with a portion of the 1911 U.S. topographical map. Most of the milepost information is from the 1919 ICC valuation map. Sapinero was originally named Soap Creek after the small creek just to the east of town. There was 112-foot through truss bridge over the creek. At milepost 313.38 there were several railroad structures, including 2 section houses, a coal bin, and a bungalow. There were also several maintenance buildings. There was no water tower in Sapinero. They simply dropped a hose into Soap Creek and pumped straight from the creek into the tender. There was a water tank at milepost 305, a location named Elk Creek Tank, 8 miles east of Sapinero. There was also a box reservoir and standpipe at Curecanti Creek that could provide water as needed. I'm not sure what year this photo was taken, but given Highway 50 is still dirt, we can surmise it was in the late 1920s or early 30s. Roosevelt's New Deal was enacted in 1933, and many of the Colorado roads were paved after that. On the south side, left in the photo, we see the stock pens and the depot in the distance. The structures on the north side, right in the photo, are also correct for the time period. Here's a close-up of the Sapinero School and the Rainbow Hotel as it appeared in 1908 and again in 1962. This drawing was taken directly from the 1919 valuation map. I added the notations. Milepost 313.4 was the location of the east switch to track 7, the 799-foot siding south of the main line. The main itself was designated track 6. The Sapinero stock pens were south of track 7 at milepost 313.82. At milepost 313.85, we find the west switch from the track 7 back to the main. Track 8 was the passing siding south of the main. The east switch to track 8 was at milepost 313.89. This siding was 1,585 feet long and ballooned around the depot on the south side. Track 8 merged back into the main east of the Y. At milepost 313.91 was the east switch for track 9, the passing siding north of the main. This siding was 2,211 feet in length and merged back to the main west of the Y. Milepost 313.97 was the location of the Sapinero depot, a coal bin, and a coaling platform. The 315 West passenger train will be leaving Sapinero in just a few minutes at 11:22 a.m., so we need to have our tickets ready and climb aboard. The east switch to the Y was at milepost 314.1. The east leg was 453 feet long. The west leg of the Y, including the tail track, was 666 feet long, and it entered the main at milepost 314.2. Here's a simplified track diagram to pull it all together. Well, it's 11:22, the conductor is calling all aboard, and the engineer is whistling off. As we leave Sapinero, we can't help but be excited about what's ahead. At milepost 314.8, known in the timetables as Lake Junction, the Lake Fork branch line to Lake City diverged from the main. The branch crossed a through truss bridge over the Gunnison River and another through truss over the Lake Fork. The high bridge in the background is Highway 50. Note the old wagon road on the south side of the river and the missing bridge over the Lake Fork. Less than 2 miles west of here, we enter the Black Canyon of the Gunnison. At milepost 316.1, we cross a 204-foot through truss which takes us from the north side to the south side of the river. Section 2, Lake Junction to Curecanti. Now go with me as we continue our journey into the Dark Canyon, a place where even the bravest train crews were reticent to go. They all knew that around any curve there could be a huge boulder on the track, or worse, falling down without warning, possibly even landing on the cab. But worst of all were the avalanches. Many a locomotive wound up in the river as a result. So be alert as we now travel through what Rudyard Kipling described this way. Quote, "We entered a gorge remote from the sun, where the rocks were 2,000 feet sheer, and where a rock-splintered river roared and howled 10 feet below a track, which seemed to have been built on the simple principle of dropping miscellaneous dirt into the river and pinning a few rails atop. There was a glory and a wonder and a mystery about the mad ride, which I felt keenly, until I had to offer prayers for the safety of the train." Unquote. Still, in spite of that, this is the place where my fondest memories were born. It's all gone now, buried under 250 or more feet of water by Morrow Point Dam. We'll talk more about that later. It's important to remember we are now on the south side of the river. At milepost 316.4, a 40-foot deck girder bridge crossed over Pine Creek, which enters the canyon from the south. At milepost 318.5, Haypress Creek enters the canyon from the north across the river from the tracks. A hay press was a machine invented in 1843 and was used to compress hay so it could be tied into bales. Milepost 319.1 is the location of the famous Chipeta Falls. It is fed by Corral Creek, a tributary from the north that was apparently unable to cut its way through the solid granite. Chipeta Falls is the reason the track had to cross to the south side of the river. There was simply no room for a railroad between the falls and the river. At milepost 319.93, there's a 240-foot through truss that carries us back to the north side of the Gunnison River. Allow me to digress here for just a moment. One of the things that drives me crazy when researching history is the many errors in the books, maps, and yes, even photos and captions. These can cause a great deal of confusion. A small error made accidentally or through inadequate research carries forward into perpetuity. A glass plate or negative printed upside down can create hours of exasperation. A mind-boggling example of this is the 1919 valuation map. The ICC valuator drew the tracks on the north side of the river all the way through the canyon. Even worse, he labeled this bridge as crossing Curecanti Creek and even drew in a non-existent stream at this point. I know from personal experience this is wrong, but where's the proof? Fortunately, the 1911 U.S. topographical map clears it up nicely. Milepost 320.45. A 32-foot through girder bridge crossed over the actual Curecanti Creek. Big Blue Creek is slightly to the east on the south side of the river, and the Curecanti Needle immediately west of the Big Blue. There was also a box reservoir at this location and a standpipe for watering thirsty locomotives. We've arrived at the Curecanti Needle, made famous by the 1908 Denver and Rio Grande logo. This photo is looking west, just east of Curecanti and Big Blue Creeks. This photo is looking east, just west of milepost 320.7, the east switch entering the 1,270-foot Curecanti siding. One of the features that make the Curecanti Needle so interesting is that it is a natural pyramid. Milepost 320.9. The Curecanti siding, west switch, and the base for maintenance section M8 were located here. This section consisted of the entire track from milepost 321 east to milepost 300. There were several structures at this location at different times, including a construction laborer's bunkhouse during the early years. The bunkhouse was later replaced by a section house, another bunkhouse, tool and handcar shed, water closet, and telegraphone. There was no siding here until 1883. These structures were torn down prior to 1940. Milepost 322.6 is the suspected location of Dead Man's Curve where Engineer Pittenger put 175 in the river. Having been told by a visiting official the trip was taking too long, he opened the throttle and reached a speed of 30 miles per hour on track that was restricted to 18. Long story short, he hit this curve way too fast and off she went. Fortunately, everyone survived this time, but there were many other wrecks in the canyon where the results were much grimmer. Section 3, Curecanti to the Montrose-Gunnison County line. This was my favorite section for reasons I'll explain later. We have arrived at milepost 323.1. This very interesting photo was taken May 6, 1940 by John Maxwell. That's Max Poor, well-known historian of the Denver, South Park, and Pacific, and Richard Kindig on the caboose, making a total of 3 famous photographers all together at one time. The trainmen were loading riprap into 5 stock cars. In the background you can see a section house, and there's a bunkhouse hidden by that tree. I call this location Ellington. This was the base for maintenance section M9 from milepost 321 west to milepost 339. In the early years of the railroad, having section workers in the canyon was a necessity. There was a lot of traffic through there with plenty of rock slides, broken rail, and other hazards. But even though it was only 15 miles from Sapinero to Cimarron, it was just too much for one crew to handle. Milepost 320.9 and milepost 323.1 were the only locations in the canyon wide enough to build anything at all. Hence, the 2 maintenance sections required structures at both locations. In addition to the 2 structures mentioned above, there was a handcar shed, a tool shed, and a water closet. Now, there's an oxymoron if I ever heard one. It certainly wasn't a closet and very definitely had no water. Why couldn't they just call it an outhouse? Except for their foundations, these 2 section houses were identical to each other. Really, the only difference between the 2 was the one at milepost 323.1 had a bridge from the porch to the track, and this one a platform. Milepost 325.4 was the Montrose-Gunnison County line. Section 4, from the Montrose-Gunnison County line to Cimarron. We are on the last leg of our journey. At milepost 327.3, we're approaching the east switch at Crystal. Crystal was a single-ended spur extending 596 feet west from here. It was at the west end of this spur that a woman on one of the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club excursions got too close to the edge and fell into the river far below. Her body was never recovered. It is also the location of one of the most confusing photographs ever taken in the canyon. It has been reproduced in several books and periodicals, and why no one ever caught the error is a mystery to me. Here it is. Look at the photo on the left. Doesn't look quite right, does it? I knew it was wrong, and I puzzled over it for some time before it dawned on me what the problem was. I opened it in Photoshop and flipped it horizontally. Eureka! Look at the picture on the right. Now it makes perfect sense, but the error caused by printing the glass plate upside down has perpetuated itself for well over 100 years. If you study this photo under magnification, you can read crystal on the signboard at the end of the spur. Milepost 327.7. Crystal Creek is my favorite bridge in the whole canyon, although it was not always so. More on that later. In this photo we see an eastbound on the 382-foot skewed howe deck truss over the Gunnison River. This bridge carries us across the river to where we turn south into the Cimarron Canyon. Here's another eastbound Rocky Mountain Railroad Club excursion. At milepost 327.83 there was a 48-foot deck girder over an unknown tributary. It's just behind the Silver Vista. By the way, this is very close to the location of the Marl Point Dam. Milepost 328.29. We've arrived at the Cimarron Canyon Bridge, a 224-foot howe deck truss over the Cimarron River. We've now traveled a total of 15 miles at an average speed of just over 18 miles per hour and have arrived at our destination. Our trip over these 15 miles has taken 45 minutes and the time is 12:07 p.m. Time for lunch. As we step down from our coach, we notice an eating house to our right, so let's go to Beans. I'll bet these young ladies, affectionately known to the locals as hash-slingers, will be happy to serve us a great meal. Notice the lady in front is holding a kid goat. Sure hope that isn't our lunch. Section 5, Cimarron, milepost 328.9. As we enter Cimarron from the east, right in this diagram, the first switch we come to is a left-hand diverging from the main to the siding known as Track 15. Track 15 extended 655 feet to the Y crossover. Track 16 is the main and is listed in two sections, 135 feet to the Track 15 crossover and 133 feet to the Y switch. The east leg of the Y at milepost 329.08 crossed Cimarron Creek on a 96-foot open-deck pile trestle. The west leg crossed Cimarron Creek at milepost 329.11 on a 96-foot frame trestle. Each leg was 695 feet in length. The water tank inside the east end of the Y had two spouts as seen in this photo. Looks like that C-16-280 is busy shuffling some cars around. Track 17 was the third Y track extending 2,106 feet to the end of track. Track 18 was a 778-foot siding south of the Y. The tail of the Y was the main line to Montrose. Track 20 is a 986-foot siding, and Track 21 is the 996-foot stock pen siding. Stock rushes, both cattle and sheep, were a major source of revenue for the railroad. In the spring, they came to the area around Cimarron for summer graze, and in the fall, some were shipped home to winter graze and some to market. A considerable amount of this traffic came from the Rio Grande Southern through Montrose. In 1883, there was a four-stall engine house at the east end of the yard. This engine house was destroyed by fire in the 1890s and replaced by a five-stall house east of the stock pens. This second engine house was also destroyed by fire on August 5, 1920. Neither of these was serviced by a turntable, hence the necessity of the Y. Cimarron was primarily a helper station for the 4% grade west over Cerro Summit to Montrose. The advent of the K-27 locomotives in 1903 meant fewer helpers were required than with the smaller C-class locos. Because of their size, the K-27s were never allowed in the canyon. By the late 1880s, Cimarron was booming with a population soaring as high as 400. However, in just a few years, there began a steady decline in population due to traffic being routed to the standard gauge portions of the railroads. Now let's take a look at some of the other Cimarron structures. The Black Canyon Hotel, the eating house, the depot, a laundry, 3 bunkhouses, a section house, and of course a bunch of water closets were all located between the tracks and Cimarron Creek. The hotel was removed in later years as the population declined. The depot was on the north side of the tracks. On the south side there was a combination ice and coal house, a vegetable cellar, and a combination freight and agent's house. Here again is the 50,000-gallon water tank located inside the Y with 2 spouts to service both the main line and track 17 to the stock pens. In addition, there were tool sheds, coal bins, and other maintenance buildings scattered throughout the area. There were also numerous other non-railroad structures located north of the creek, which included houses, a coal shed, a general store, several of the ubiquitous water closets, and some nondescript buildings. This completes our trip through the Black Canyon and brings us to what for me is the most memorable part of this tale. You may remember I had given milepost 323.1 the name Ellington. Sometime in the late 1920s or early 1930s, the railroad decided to move the track maintainers for section M8 to Sapinero and to section M9 to Cimarron. This left 2 sets of structures, one at Curecanti and the other at milepost 323.1. My grandmother, Marguerite Rice, was the only one of 6 Rice girls who did not marry a railroader. Instead, she married Terrell Ellington, a postal worker in Hotchkiss, Colorado. Grandpa was appointed postmaster in Grand Junction in 1946 and served there until he retired in 1958. Through the efforts of Grandma's brother, Uncle Art, the master mechanic mentioned in the introduction, my grandparents acquired the structures at milepost 323.1. Now you know why I call this location Ellington. This became the Ellington's fishing cabin from 1932 until my grandparents had both passed away. That's my grandfather on the porch. From 1932 through 1949, the only access to the canyon was by train. The man in the center is my mother's older brother Albert. The man on the right is Uncle Art. Passenger services through the canyon ended in 1936, but there were mixed trains after that. U.S. Highway 50 was seriously washed out in the spring of 1944, and passenger service was resumed for a few months while the highway was being repaired. The railroad applied for abandonment in 1938, and the tracks were finally removed from Montrose to Sapinero in 1949. The roadbed was graded, the bridges planked, and it became a fisherman's road. The first time I was there was in the summer of 1950. The trip over the narrow dirt road was uneventful until we reached that long Cimarron deck bridge. Crossing that was very frightening to a 6-year-old boy, and that's one of those things that stay with you. But it got worse. Much worse. Crossing the Crystal Creek Bridge over the Gunnison River was the most terrifying thing I had experienced in my entire young life. But all that was soon forgotten the moment we arrived at the section house referred to henceforth as the Ellington cabin. There was Grandma and Grandpa standing on the front porch. This was great. The river just a few yards away, the wonderful smells coming from Grandma's kitchen, a nice cozy bed with a heavy quilt, and of course the outhouse. I thought the whole place was really neat until I discovered the wasp nest in the outhouse. I'll tell you, I didn't need to go in there again for a long time. After that, I spent many weekends at the cabin every summer until 1957. Grandpa became my very best friend. He taught me to fly fish standing in the Gunnison River right off the point of this rock. We'd pick choke cherries for Grandma's jelly. We'd do the necessary chores, and he'd tell me story after story about the railroad as well as important things about life and living it to its fullest. Fishermen would occasionally spend the night in the bunkhouse. Grandma would graciously prepare their meals in the cabin. From the time I was 6 years old to the ripe old age of 13, I walked almost the entire length of the roadbed from Crystal to Curecanti. We drove the old roadbed to Sapinero every spring on our way to Iola for willow fly season. On those drives, we crossed the Gunnison River twice, always stopping between the bridges to gaze at the beautiful Chipeta Falls across the river. I can't always remember where I put my keys, but those memories are crystal clear. Any tale about this part of the country would be incomplete without a good fish story, so here goes. Every spring the willow flies hatch out from their larvae called helgamites. These creepy little bugs have been keeping those beautiful rainbow trout fed through the winter, allowing them to get nice and fat. When the larva hatches out in the spring, the air is full of willow flies, and the trout go into a feeding frenzy you have to see to believe. The whole river in the area near Iola becomes one big roiling mass of trout. Grandpa, Uncle Albert, my dad, and I would stand in the river, grab a willow fly from the air, put it on a hook, and cast it out. Almost immediately you'd have a tough fight on your hands. Those trout seemed to object strenuously to getting caught. At any rate, in just a few hours we would fill out our total limit of 70 fish. There's a fish story any fisherman would love to experience. We know fishermen are liars, but this guy certainly has proof. 1957 was the last year I was in the canyon, and it was just with my immediate family. I was 13 then, and we were there to pick up any personal belongings left in the cabin. Grandpa's glaucoma had reached a point where it wasn't safe for him to go there anymore, and Grandma was ill most of the time. When we left, we boarded it up and never went back. At the time, it didn't seem important, so I never asked for any details regarding either the acquisition or the disposition of the place. I wish now I had. Today, I'm the last living member of our family to have ever been there. The Bureau of Reclamation got their dam built at Morrow Point between 1963 and 1968, making it impossible to ever go there again. It is 350 feet deep at the dam, putting Ellington under about 250 feet of water. Even if they drained the lake, you still couldn't find any remains because by now it's buried under tons of silt. This brings us to the last section where we will take a look at the way things are today and what has been done to preserve at least a portion of the history of this magnificent canyon and its challenging railroad. Through the efforts of many people and organizations, there are still lots of things worth seeing in the area. It's a very beautiful place with mountains and rivers, colorful fields of wildflowers in the spring, and the glorious turning of aspen trees in the fall. As bad as I hate that dam, I'll be the first to admit both reservoirs, Morrow Point and Blue Mesa, are among the most awe-inspiring mountain lakes in the world. The Blue Mesa Dam is located just west of Lake Junction. Construction was started in 1961, necessitating the relocation of both U.S. Highway 50 and State Highway 149. The Sapinero Cemetery was relocated to a higher elevation and the town soon followed. The river is now a lake extending more than halfway from there to Gunnison. You can still see some of the old roadbed on the south side of the river at Pine Creek. There's a staircase with 232 steps down to the Pine Creek Trail. Don't forget, that's 232 steps back up. When the lake is low, you can walk the roadbed for quite a distance. If you take the boat tour from Pine Creek, you can see Chipeta Falls and the Curecanti Needle. The last time I was there in May 2009, the only commercial structure in the once thriving town of Cimarron was Newberry's store on Highway 50. The National Park Service maintains a visitor center, a campground, and a picnic area where the railroad tracks in Cimarron once existed. There is a display which includes stock pens with loading chutes, 2 stock cars, and a maintenance away car. You can still drive the old roadbed through Cimarron Canyon to the trestle display. At the time of my last visit in 2009, C16 number 278, boxcar 3132, and caboose 0577 were displayed on the trestle. Due to their deteriorating condition, I heard they were later removed for restoration. The Park Service planned to have them back right away, but the restoration turned out to be much more expensive and time-consuming than originally thought. It's been many years since I was there, so I hope by now they're home again. These interesting maps, courtesy of the Park Service, really make understanding then and now much easier. Thank you for your kind attention. I hope you enjoyed this clinic. I will be delighted to answer any questions. Please email me to dakotajones3442@gmail.com.
Well, thank you, Terry. So I'm looking at the chat window for any questions for Terry. First of all, the Cimarron area and the Black Canyon is close to my heart. That's what I plan to be modeling in SN3. So it's been really interesting talking to Terry about his experiences there, and that's why I have the picture of that very bridge at the very end of his presentation right behind me here. So any questions you have for Terry, put in the chat. So Terry, if you're there, I have one interesting question. I heard a mention of a telegraph phone at one of the section houses or stations. Do you know what that is?
Yes. A telegraph phone was actually a combination of a phone and a telegraph. And the dispatching through those areas was primarily by telegraph. And the telegrapher would write out the orders and then hand them up to the locomotive crew when they came in. But they could use that as a telephone as well.
Cool. Okay. And I think not long ago, I think the newsletter that comes from the Friends of the Cumbrous and Toltec Scenic Railroad had quite a long article about different way. I think it mentioned something about that about a year ago in there. There was something in there. Somebody asks, do you have any images or pictures of the Iola depot?
No, I'm sorry, I do not.
Okay. And whilst you were talking about, I've been to the Black Canyon many times. I used to live not too far from there. It is just a very bizarre chasm in the ground. I was calculating if it's 2,000 feet, 2,500 deep. In SN3 scale, that's about 40 feet deep. That's kind of like the side of a house. So I imagine my PBL locomotives ring along the footings of the house and looking up at the side of the canyon next to it. That's an interesting way to put it into perspective, I think, to actually look at that.
Yeah, it's deep and wide and not very wide. That's the thing. That literally the sun only shines there in some areas for about an hour a day. It's black.
No, it's quite an amazing thing, and it makes an interesting modeling topic if you can do it floor to ceiling. Someone, I think Glenn Farley mentions that, yeah, there are shots of the Iola Depot in some books out there, yeah. And I agree with you, Terry. I've looked at some pictures in some of the books and they're just plain wrong, right? They get directions wrong and so on. I like you, I've squinted at them and trying to figure out that's not right. So it's like whenever you study anything, like you figure it out.
It's very easy to print a glass plate upside down, and when you do, it just flips it so that it's wrong. But what bothered me about all of that is because even today, it still shows up in books, and it's wrong. And if you look at it with a magnifying glass, you can't read what's on that sign until it's flipped over. So
it's kind of blindingly obvious when you look in a bit of detail. So there were no other questions on the chat unless anybody wants to ask anything for Terry. Actually, so now some questions are coming up. Chuck and Scott Proudfoot mentioned that the telegraphone, that one there was the first one west of the Mississippi, is what they say.
I didn't know that, but yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, Rod Johnson is asking, so was the locomotive weight restriction due to the wood bridges? I believe it was, but yeah, Terry?
Actually not, because by the time of the K-27, all the wood bridges had been replaced by steel metal bridges. The restriction was because of the poor trackage through there. And you put a K-27 in there, and it just spread the rails.
Yep.
You remember what Kipling said about it? Yeah, I mean, throw a bunch of dirt into the river and put tracks on it. Yet, no, that wasn't. The K-27s were just too heavy.
Yep. And Martin states that, yeah, the Cimarron display has been restored as of this year. And yeah, I was out there, I think at the Denver convention a few years ago, and I think it was still under refurbishment then. But yeah, Martin says the Cimarron display has been restored. And I guess occasionally I would drive around that neighborhood when I lived in Albuquerque. My ex-wife would visit veterinary clinics in that region. I'd fly her into Montrose and would drive out there. And I drove out there in the middle of winter once, which you don't normally see it, when it was maybe 20 below and thick fog. It's a very different experience going to Cimarron and Gunnison when it's so cold and you could hardly see like 50 feet in front of you, compared to these beautiful summer fall pictures we see. It was really interesting to see it like that.
Yeah, the Newberry store there, I went to school with those kids, and there was a lot of children up in that Cimarron area at that time. And they rode a school bus from there to Montrose to go to school every day, back and forth, that 20 miles. And sometimes the weather over Cerro Summit was just incredibly bad. So it's
that I can imagine. Somebody who doesn't really have a name, a nameless person with an iPad, says, thanks for presentation, Terry. I need to buy some more rock molds. So I would agree with that one. And actually, Tom Smith reminds us that, yes, 278 looks great sitting on the Cimarron Creek trestle since the refurbishment. Oh, and Lynn Wickersham is asking you, Terry, do you still live in Colorado? I know the answer to that, but...
Yeah, go ahead and answer it.
Oh, no, he doesn't.
I live 40 miles south of Phoenix. I'll tell you why. I grew up in Colorado, and the reason I live in Arizona now is because here you don't have to shovel sunshine.
It's not a problem we have in Seattle, shoveling sunshine. It's cloudy right now. It's a gray, dismal morning here. So thank you, Terry. I really appreciate it. That was close to my heart. And I know several of us up here, like Glenn Farley and I, are both people who want to model that area, are modeling that area up here in the Northwest. And I know there's plenty of others. So I really appreciated that. So thank you, Terry. Virtual applause.